In this segment, we're going to learn how to assess the organization in 3 different ways. The first way is we're going to learn how to assess the outcomes that it wants to have from innovation. The second is we're going to learn how to assess the organization's culture and competency that are required to create that outcome. And finally, we're going to learn how to assess individuals and their ability to create the culture and competency needed to create the outcome. Well, the way to think about this is to think about them like a Russian nesting doll. You think that there's a small doll, and the small doll is you as an individual, as a leader. The next doll over you is the organizational doll. It's the doll of the communal organization, and that's where culture and competency is contained. And the final doll is the universal doll, or the strategic doll, that really determines what outcome we're likely to create. So like in a Russian nesting doll, imagine that you're looking up, imagine that you're looking down, and imagine that you're looking around. We need to look in all 3 ways in order to assess how innovation works and doesn't work and needs to work in our organization. If you'd like to take the innovation assessment, go to the URL on your screen now. It will only take you 15 minutes, and your results will be emailed back to you simultaneously. So let's learn how to assess an organization's innovation capability and competency by looking at a case example. Let's look at Apple. That's a company many of us know. Well, we're going to compare the profile of the company to the narrative or the timeline of the company in 3 acts. So remember, Apple was formed in the 1970s in a garage by Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. It was a classic entrepreneurial concern. They really introduced the microcomputer revolution. It happened in a much easier way than some of their competitors. They had a stick-it-to-the-man attitude, and they were the darlings of the stock exchanges, and artists and educators flocked to Apple as a revolution in making computers easy enough for all of us to use. Well, in the second act, the rest of the computing industry got into the act, and they built a lot of standards. They operated off the same platform, which was different than Apple's, and they had a turnkey way of doing this. And as the industry grew, Apple was more of an outsider in the very segment that they helped to create. So what happened at Apple is the Apple board brought in a new leader, and the new leader pushed the old leader, Steve Jobs, out of the organization, and Apple became a turnkey operation where they developed software and computers that were relatively the same as the rest of the industry, and if they weren't the same, they were clones that could run the rest of the industry's software on the same platform. In the third segment, or the third chapter of this story, Apple over the years begins to lose its way, and it almost becomes bankrupt in the late 1990s, which brings the founder, Steve Jobs, back into the company, who revitalizes the company with radical innovation, with a new ecosystem that goes beyond the computer, and it includes things like a music downloading site, it includes handheld devices, and a new way of designing computers. It's very similar to the initial profile that he built Apple on, but now with a new focus on making money and producing replicable and predictable returns. So in this last profile, Apple looks a lot like Apple did when it was a startup. And the reason is simple. The risk of trying something radical and the reward of staying where you're at was reversed, just like when Apple started out. And it turns out the only significant difference was now Apple was not only a green, create, radical company, but it also had a secondary emphasis on blue because they had to produce replicable and reliable earnings. It's important to remember that assessments are not the truth. They're basically our perceptions of the truth. There are 3 ways in which we assess the organizational readiness to innovate. The first way is called psychometric, and that's where we give a test to individuals where they self-report. They tell us what they think is going on in the organization. Now, the good news about psychometric tests is they tell us a lot about ourselves, they tell us a lot about our bias, but they're not very reliable because they're not very objective. The second way to assess are sociometric tests. Sociometric tests are actually highly reliable. And the reason is it's a group's perception on how innovation is going to work or not work in an organization. A great example of a sociometric test is consumer confidence. What people believe about the economy typically anticipates whether we're going to have a bull or a bear market. Finally, there's financial benchmarking to identify the innovativeness of an organization. Now, the good news is financial benchmarking, because it's quantifiable, is very accurate. The bad news is it's not very predictive, because it's looking at organizational performance in the rearview mirror. So when assessing an organization's readiness to innovate, remember, look up by financially benchmarking, look down by using psychometric tests, and look around by using sociometric assessments. So let's look at an example. Let's consider Megacore. Megacore right now is an old industrial heavy manufacturer. It's extremely red. It's all about efficiency and quality. But what it wants to be is green, because it wants to revitalize itself. And it has a lot of good technology that could really drive itself into some of these emerging markets like green technology and eco-technology. But the people that run Megacore are all blue. They come from the investment banker mentality. It's all about making shareholder value increase. So we've got some challenges here that we have to put together. We have to match the outcome that they want with the practices that they have. So the first thing we need to do is make really tough and disciplined decisions to stop some of the non-essential red practices that are inhibiting our green practices. So that means we can't try to be perfect everywhere. That means that everything isn't going to be efficient. That means that everything is not going to conform to a standard. There are things we need to stop. That's the true cost of getting to the green outcomes that we want. Now, once we've stopped some of these practices, we have to start some green practices. So we're going to run some diversified experiments. We're going to hire some people who are maybe different than the people we have right now. And we're going to try and anticipate where everything is going to go in the future. So we've stopped some red practices and we've introduced some green practices. But even more than that, it means that our leaders on a personal level are going to have to change. So our blue leaders that are all about decisive action and getting results in this quarter and managing by objectives are going to have to stop leading that way, because it's inhibiting the type of growth that we want. We want these leaders to lead in a green way, because that will lead to green practices, which in turn will lead to green outcomes. So we need those leaders to stop being so blue, to start being green, and doing things like imagining the future, supporting some radical experiments, and initiating the change. So putting it all together, the leaders act differently. It creates different types of practices, culture, and competency in the organization, which in turn produces the green results that we seek. The organization that was an old mainline manufacturing company is now positioned to be in the new ecotech industry that it has the ability to create and succeed in. There are several uses for innovation assessments. You can use them to help you hire. You can use them to staff out teams. You can look at your organization and determine its development needs. You can develop the culture and capability required to carry out your growth strategy. Now it's time to practice prismatic thinking again. What type is your organization's strength right now? What type does it need to be in the future? What type is your organization's weakness? What type is it likely to be in the future? What type of culture and competency does your organization need to develop now? What type of culture and competency does your organization need to develop in the future? In this segment, we're going to talk about innovation processes. Now, there's two basic varieties of innovation processes. The first variety